Hi, I'm Jonathan Haupt, the Executive Director of the nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center here in Beaufort, South Carolina, coming to you with another Museum at Home Monday short video. This one's a little bit longer than some of the earlier pieces that I've done because it's going to involve a clip that I originally did for the Office of Cultural Affairs on Hilton Head Island last week for a live Facebook post. And it has to do with this magazine right here, Look Back, 1965 to 1972, project of the Beaufort Middle School. So I hope you enjoy the video. Hi, this is Jonathan Haupt. I'm the Executive Director of our nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center in Beaufort, South Carolina, joining you for another Tuesday at 2 live guest post here on the Culture HHI Facebook page. I want to talk about two interconnected things this week, and in some of the recent videos I've been doing here on this page, I've gotten to talk about Pat Conroy as student and later as teacher at Beaufort High School, and today's post kind of continues that theme. But I also want to tell you a little bit about what we, the Conroy Center, are doing right now this summer as well, which also kind of relates back to Pat's experiences as a student and ultimately as a teacher as well. So two summers ago, in 2018, we began our own summer camp program for young writers and young artists called Camp Conroy, lovely name. And we began that in partnership with Beaufort Arts Council and also Technical College of the Low Country. And that first summer, when we were still figuring out what Camp Conroy was, and really what Conroy Center was, we had 9 students, just an amazing group of students. And over the course of the 2 weeks of that first Camp Conroy, those campers collectively wrote, illustrated, designed, edited, and ultimately published a 32-page book together, set right here in the Low Country. Beautiful submissions of their own work, working collaboratively and individually to produce just an incredible book. We had a good time doing it. We thought we should definitely do that again next year. Maybe the camp will be a little bigger. So last year, summer of 2019, we held the second annual Camp Conroy, and we had 30 campers, a huge leap forward from the original 9. So much so that we had to change locations for the camp, and that took us to what is now Beaufort Middle School. But Beaufort Middle School was Beaufort High School when Pat Conroy was a student and later a teacher. So there we were having our own Camp Conroy on the very campus, the very grounds where Pat himself had once been both a student and a teacher. And Pat wrote beautifully about the summer between his junior year and his senior year at Beaufort High School, which would be the 1963 summer, in an essay in his cookbook called The Bill Duffert Summer, which I mentioned in the last video post I did. So in many ways, having Camp Conroy at Beaufort Middle School was our way of not only continuing Pat's work as a teacher and a writer, but also honoring that experience of the Bill Duffert Summer. This year, the world is completely different, obviously, and we're not able to hold Camp Conroy in person. So after much consideration of what to do, what would be in the best interests of everyone involved, we decided to hold our first ever virtual Camp Conroy. So for 2 weeks, starting next week, in fact, June 15th through the 26th, we'll have a Camp Conroy that's meeting online, very much like what we're doing right now. And we have a dozen campers who are joining us from 5 different states, including kids who would not have been able to participate in an in-person version of the camp. So it's going to be a brand new experience for all of us. And even though registration is full for our virtual camp, there is still a way that young writers and artists in your life, ages 8 to 14, can participate entirely free in our Camp Conroy. Some of the video instruction that we'll do during the camp we'll make available on our own YouTube and Facebook channels. But there's also a call for submissions for any writers or artists in that age range, age 8 to 14, to submit their work for our Camp Conroy campers to then review, edit, and ultimately decide if they want to publish it in their book. So I'll put that call for submissions, the open call for submissions, in the comments for this video, and you can have a look. And if you've got somebody in your life who is interested in submitting, they have until this Sunday, June 14th, to do that. We've got 3 instructors for Camp Conroy. 2 of them have been with us since we came up with this idea. It's Lisa Ann Cullen and Miho Kinas, both incredibly talented artists, writers, and teachers. And they're joined this year by a woman who has been doing this sort of book building summer camp for a long time, longer than we have. Her name's Robin Prince Monroe, And her camp, which she used to teach in the upstate of South Carolina, is a big part of what inspired us to do our Camp Conroy here in the Low Country. So we're so lucky to have Robin join the team this year as well. In addition to those trio of instructors and me, we also have this great group of guest instructors who are participating in the camp too. And I'm checking my notes because I don't want to leave anybody out. We have a camp counselor this year, and that's our own Beaufort High School intern, Holland Perryman. And also joining us is the Conroy Center's other staff member, Brooke McKinney, who's our communications and events coordinator. They're both teaching sessions in the camp in addition to assisting with it kind of behind the scenes as well. And then beyond that, we have Lila Arnold from Low Country Raptors coming to do a sort of virtual field trip with us. And we also have Kathleen Tier from Beaufort County Library, and Javon Daly, who you probably know from this very Facebook page, if not from other contexts, and also some really wonderful authors and artists, Robin Hood Black and Rebecca Justice Chamberlain, both joining us to do workshops with our campers, and some local writers as well, Susan Diamond Riley and Stephanie Austin Edwards, who do quite a lot of adult workshops with us, doing some workshops for the younger writers as well. The whole camp experience just looks remarkable to me. I'm so amazed with what our instructors and our counselor have been able to do to take our lesson plans and pivot them and turn them into something we can do online instead. So I'm really excited to see how this plays out, and I'm thrilled we've got a dozen campers joining us from 5 states for whatever virtual Camp Conroy becomes. They are still going to produce a book together, which we will have available by the end of July. And even though we're not able to be present in Beaufort Middle School for the camp this year, for the 2 weeks of the camp, we are going to have a culminating event there in July, something that you'll be able to participate in either in person, if that's possible for you, or online as well. That partnership with Beaufort Middle School is just really wonderful and essential to us, and we wanted to honor that and continue that in some way this year. So that is the way that we get to do that, by having the book launch of sorts, if you will, and a chance for our young writers and artists to show off and share their work and see their work published, many of them for the very first time in the Camp Conroy anthology. So that comes up at the end of July. I tell you all of that for 2 reasons. One, because it's exciting that we're doing this Camp Conroy, and 2, because that takes us back to Beaufort Middle School, where Pat Conroy himself had been when it was Beaufort High School. And I want to tell you about an artifact that relates to Pat's time at Beaufort High School. It's at the Conroy Center. It's probably one of the least explored, least looked at artifacts that we have in the center, and it's fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating pieces I think we have. This is it. It's called Look Back 1965-1972. This was a magazine, big, beautiful magazine that was put together in 2002, so 18 years ago, by a group of 8th grade humanities students at Beaufort Middle School. And this was funded in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities. So this is an NEH project, and money well spent from what I would say, what I see in here. This is a remarkable publication. Those students, those 8th graders in 2002, were assigned to research and write about what those years of integration at Beaufort High School would have looked like, and that's the 1965-1972 time period that the book covers. So a lot of the articles that the students wrote have to do with the cultural context of the time, the music, the artwork, politics, popular culture. But the heart of what's in this book are articles written following a series of presentations by people who lived through those experiences, by students and teachers from Beaufort High at that time, black and white both. So in 1964-1965 school year is when the first 3 African American students were enrolled in Beaufort County School District schools. Roland Washington was the first student at Beaufort High School, Craig Washington at Beaufort Elementary School, and Janelle Drake at Mossy Oaks Elementary. Roland and Craig were both 2 of the presenters for this project, for the Look Back project. So there are articles written by students, again by 8th graders, featuring both of those men as they came and talked about what their experiences were like at Beaufort High. There's a bunch of other folks in here too, including, but certainly not limited to, Grace Dennis, who was Pat Conroy's homeroom teacher at Beaufort High, Bill Duffert, who was Pat Conroy's principal, who I've mentioned in these videos before, Connie Faust Hipp, who was one of Pat Conroy's psychology students and also a participant in the African American history class that Pat taught at Beaufort High, Ewell Jones, Emery Campbell, Herman Grather, just a remarkable group of folks are in this publication, and they each came one after the other to give these presentations to the 8th grade students, again in 2002 at what's now Beaufort Middle School, sort of sharing their remembrances of that period of transformation at Beaufort High School in the 1960s and early 1970s. Well, one of the central figures in this project is a guy I've not mentioned yet, and he was so important he made it on the cover. That's Gene Norris right there, who was Pat Conroy's junior year English teacher. Just to sort of put this in context, who are the other people important enough to the 8th grade students of 2002 to make the cover of this magazine? In addition to Gene Norris, we have Martin Luther King Jr., we have Bob Dylan by virtue of a quote, and we have Batman. So that's the company that Gene Norris is keeping in the eyes of 8th grade students in 2002. So Gene Norris is assigned to come in and give a presentation for these students, and he's featured in here too. There's beautiful 2 pages about Gene and his experiences at Beaufort High, both before, during, and after integration, not just at Beaufort High, but really his reflection on the whole time period in and outside of the school district. But Gene brought a special guest when he came to speak to these middle school students. And you can probably guess who it is, given what we generally talk about in these videos. He shows up with Pat Conroy. Pat is 57 years old at this point, again, it's 2002. Pat is not scheduled to be there. Gene hasn't told anybody he's brought Pat. He just kind of did it. Good Gene Norris thing to do. So I want to read for you the 2 pages that 3 8th grade students, Jennifer Bianchi, Amy Jumper, and Rachel Holland, wrote about this entirely unexpected visit from Pat Conroy, Beaufort Middle School in 2002. I should probably apologize in advance for what 57-year-old Pat Conroy thought was appropriate to say to 8th grade students in 2002. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. But I think it would be a disservice to the subject and the writers to do anything other than read the whole article to completion. So again, this is about 2 pages, and this is Pat Conroy's entirely unscheduled, unannounced appearance, Beaufort Middle School, 2002, talked to a group of 8th graders. How many of y'all are military brats? Ain't it fun? Hello, military brats. No one ever said hi to me. I'll say hi to y'all. This is how Pat Conroy started his speech to 8th graders at Beaufort Middle School. The planned speaker for the day was Gene Norris, a teacher at Beaufort High School at the time of integration. Our teacher, Gail Carroll, stepped outside to talk to Mr. Morris, and when they came back in, Pat Conroy was right there with him. Mr. Norris talked to the class about his teaching experiences during integration. Then Mr. Conroy stepped up. After greeting the military brats, he told the students about his life and school years. In 1961, Mr. Conroy was going to high school in Washington, D.C. He was a sophomore. This was the family's 23rd move and Pat's 3rd high school. When Pat found out they were moving to Beaufort, South Carolina, he asked his father in despair, "Do they even have a high school?" His father honestly did not know. No one in the family had ever heard of Beaufort. They dropped his father off in Cherry Point to do some work, and then he and the rest of the family continued to Beaufort. As the family drove across the bridge, Pat gave his mother grief about moving again. His mother calmly replied, and what Mr. Conroy said was, quote, military wife fashion. "Son, we've got to give the nation a fighter pilot. If we need to give him a fighter pilot in Beaufort, South Carolina, then it's our job, and we'll do it." Later, 2 books were written about Beaufort that mentioned Pat Conroy as a Beaufort native, with people claiming to remember him riding his tricycle around the point. He assumes that his mom's advice really worked. He made Beaufort his hometown, and he loves it. "The only weird thing you could be in Beaufort at that time was Roman Catholic," he said, and he was just that. Before he came to Beaufort, he had been attending Catholic schools, where when you came into the classroom, you had to stand by your desk and wait for the nun to come in. His first day when he walked into his class at Beaufort High School, he thought he walked into a war zone. He stood at attention by his desk. Mr. Norris, the teacher, walked in and pushed Pat into a seat and looked at him as though he were crazy. Those 2 have since created a relationship that will forever endure. Mr. Conroy told us that his father had high hopes for him in sports. He signed Pat up for football, basketball, and baseball. "Every year of my life, from the time I was 5, he would sign me up for all 3, Pat said. Pat's father always picked out all of his school courses. One year at Beaufort High, he decided to take typing without his father's consent. When his father found out, assuming he was rebelling and it was a liberal move, he moved Pat from typing to physics. The physics teacher just happened to be a woman who hated Pat. Pat had the same feelings toward her. One year, for his science project, he made a big, pretty box and labeled it, quote, Principle of Reflection. When his teacher got on her knees and looked inside the box, she saw a mirror on the other side. She stood up and kicked the box. Mr. Conroy was also barely in the National Honor Society, of which his rival teacher was the sponsor. As the graduates were walking to the podium with their, quote, gold tassels of pride, end quote, she was looking over the grades and noticed that Pat was 0.1% below the 2.6 minimum. She ran onto the stage, jerked off Pat's gold tassel, and in one motion replaced it with, quote, the purple tassel of shame. He said, This has been a scar on my entire life. It's a good Pat Conroy story. Pat went to the Citadel, where he played basketball. His father had not seen one of his games, but then the game his father finally did come see, Pat's team lost. Pat scored 25 points in the game and was the high scorer for both teams. At the end of the game, his dad put him up against a wall with his fist and said, You couldn't hold a candle to me on the best night of your life. I want you to know you're not worth a crap. Pat later taught psychology and government at Beaufort High School. After the assassination of Martin Luther King, a group of black students asked him to teach Afro-American history. He said that he would, but he would have to learn a little more about it himself. When he made that announcement that the course would be offered, 100 black students showed up for the meeting. The principal said that if Mr. Conroy was to offer that class, there would have to be some white children too. The class ended up having 25 black kids and 2 white kids. And one of those white students was Connie Hip. Hey, Connie. After teaching at Beaufort High, Pat moved on to teach at Defusky, a small, untouched island. The island had no proper schools or adequate living conditions. When he was teaching on Defusky, he wrote a letter to the school superintendent saying, The school is a garbage heap. Wish me luck. 9 months later, he was fired for a long list of reasons and moved back to the mainland. Since then, Pat has written 6 books and is working on another. We feel very lucky to have met him and to have talked to him, something for which our parents can actually envy us. That's the end of the 2-page article on Pat Conroy's entirely unannounced, unscripted, unplanned appearance, Beaufort Middle School, 2002, to talk to the group of 8th graders who are working on this Look Back project. And he did this because Gene Norris told him to. Did this because Gene is always looking out for Pat as his teacher and his friend and as an advocate in every sense of that word for Beaufort and for its students and its young people. Well, it was Gene Norris who took Pat Conroy as a student in 1961 out to Penn Center at a time when Penn was one of the few places in the country where blacks and whites could safely meet together. And because of that, it was a safe haven for a lot of activity during the civil rights movement. And it was where many of the civil rights leaders of the time were able to go and interact with each other and give presentations as well, which Gene would attend as one of the few white people in Beaufort to do that with his 16, 17-year-old Pat Conroy at his side. And Pat talked about that quite a bit when he was inducted into Penn Center's 1862 circle in 2010. And I want to read just a little bit, just a brief paragraph from Pat's induction speech, which has been reprinted in one of Pat's books, from that 1862 circle induction. This is not a section about Gene Norris, although we'll get back to Gene in just a second. But this is from Pat, sort of talking about what that experience at Penn Center meant to him, the experience that Gene gave him. So this is Pat in 2010. It was at Penn Center that I met Dr. Martin Luther King on a street now named for him. I also met Ralph Abernathy, Andy Young, Jesse Jackson, Julian Bond, and the entire leadership of that fabulous civil rights movement that brought the South kicking and screaming into the 20th century. I watched my whole country change because of meetings that had taken place at Penn Center. I'm living proof that Penn Center can change a white boy's life. You changed me utterly, and I'm forever grateful to you. And it was that night, after giving that speech, that Pat Conroy started putting things in motion to be buried on Penn Center property, be buried at St. Helena Memorial Gardens, where he is. And we've come to think of that as Pat's last act as a teacher. He knew that his readers and his fans, folks like us, folks like me, would want to go out and visit that gravesite for various reasons to do that, because Pat had been in the habit of visiting the graves of so many writers that were dear to him, Thomas Wolfe among them. And he knew he would be coming. He knew he'd want to visit that grave. And you can't get to Pat's grave without going through the Harding Penn Center and learning at least a little something about the remarkable history of that property. So that is why we think of it as Pat's last act as a teacher. He's still teaching. Even in death, he is still teaching in that way. And it was Gene Norris who took Pat out to Penn Center for the first time. I tell you that so I can tell you this. Gene Norris appears in this book. He's profiled, I mentioned that, and he brought Pat Conroy there, which I told you as well. But it turns out that Gene is actually responsible for arranging for a lot of the speakers in this series and for helping these students out in 2002. This is 2 years before Gene Norris passes away in 2004. Gene, like Pat, was a teacher from beginning to end. His whole life, couldn't switch it off. It was who he was. And he is doing things for these students in 2002 that are very similar to what he was doing for Pat in 1961. So I want to read for you the closing page, the dedication. The whole project here is dedicated to Gene Norris. And this is what the 8th grade students in 2002 had to say about Gene Norris in thanks for his guidance, for being a teacher, for being a friend, for being an ally in every sense of that word. Some common themes arose from the collection of these personal stories: memories of the infamous Beaufort High School breezeway, reactions to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and a unanimous, overwhelming respect by fellow faculty and former students for Mr. Eugene Norris. And then there's a quote from Pat Conroy. He was a rare and valuable white man to this town. He was the first one I knew who was actually doing something about integration. Then it's back to the students. From the early stages of designing this unit of study, through the process of identifying and recruiting speakers, to sharing his own personal experiences, Mr. Gene Norris has been our guiding light. He has been the quiet yet enthusiastic cheerleader and biggest supporter in our goal to help 8th grade students look to the near past, to see discrimination, yet recognize triumph, and ultimately appreciate the struggles and courage of the previous generations. Mr. Norris not only lived the civil rights movement in Beaufort, he led it. He was among the few whites included in Penn Center retreats with Dr. King. He was instrumental in bringing harmonious unification of Beaufort High School. He was known by blacks and whites alike for his fairness, his integrity, his audacity, and his generosity. His guidance 30 years later throughout this project has been an invaluable asset and a gift for which we are most grateful. Peace and thanks, Mr. Norris, the Beaufort Middle School 8th grade humanities class of 2002. It's a remarkable artifact. It's a remarkable story. And it cements for me what a remarkable teacher Gene Norris was, not just to Pat Conroy, not just to any one student, but to the whole community of Beaufort. What a remarkable, generous, kind-hearted advocate he was for the lives of everyone in this community and well beyond it as well. It's a good way to live a life, and it's something I hope you all will think about. Thank you for joining me here on this week's live guest post on the Culture HHI page. Please do come see us at the Pat Conroy Literary Center, either in person or online. And you all take care and be safe.